Settler cabins. Me and the majority of the people living in the Lost River Valley, driving along Route 20, are thinking about our daily lives and pass by the surviving little settler cabins without noticing them or knowing anything about their history. For generations, they've been forgotten. It's amazing that so many of them still stand. Even though more and more of them are being torn down every year, some, despite their weathered and decayed appearance, have owners who refuse to tear them down. The cabins are reminders of ancestral roots and the sacrifice of those who came before them, so their descendants could have better lives. I became a little obsessed with these tiny cabins. After noticing one, me and a friend began looking to see if there were others. It almost became a joking pastime, as we would point out what we'd missed the whole time we'd lived in this little valley. We found another and then another. About every half mile, depending on what road you were traveling, was a settler's home. As we hunted these little structures, my friend Chris and I started building a fascinating library of photos and videos of these settler cabins. We not only found cabins from one end of the valley to the other, but we discovered a few of their stories, of the settlers who built here. We decided to make this documentary to help preserve history. We discovered in the Library of Congress little film clips made by Thomas Edison at the end of the 1800s. Unusable parts of them are included within this documentary. Please remember, these silent clips were experimental productions at the time of Edison's new patented motion picture films. Edison's film crew documented in little short clips Native American dances, camps, and daily life. He documented trappers, scouts, settlers, prospectors, mining, boilers, and steam engines, foundries, blacksmiths, stores, the mail system, dances, locomotives, and much more. We also found other films around that time period in the Library of Congress that are also included within this documentary. Please have a little understanding when viewing these clips. No one taught them how to make film. It was a great experiment about how fast to crank the film and its exposure time and focus. These film crews were pioneers of the industry, or the bottom end of the learning curve, and thus the quality is that of a child with a new camera. At least the pictures weren't just of their feet. Also, this ancient film decayed over generations since it was not digitized. We enhanced and colorized many of the portions used to help give insight and first-hand perspective from generations ago of what the true American dream was like 160 to 120 years ago. Now back to our little cabins in the Lost River Valley. Most of these settler cabins were only about 10 feet by 20 feet or 20 feet by 20 feet in size, with a center height of 8 feet. The roofs were comprised of small logs and sod. If a door still hung on the structure, it was comprised of log-braced logs. If the hinges on the doors were not replaced, they existed as rawhide. The rawhide windows had rotten away long ago. Many of the cabins were not fastened with spikes or nails, but with wooden pegs. Holes were bored between logs and wooden dowels. Straight sticks about the size of the holes were pounded between them as the logs were stacked on top of each other. These little cabins are so very humble in appearance that they go unnoticed by most. A precious little archaeological discovery have been hiding in plain sight. Little gems have been preserved to remember our beginnings. Where most of the West's original homes had been destroyed generations ago as newer, nicer homes replaced them, and non-related owners took their place. Many of the remains of the old settler cabins now have a layer of metal roofing placed on top of them to keep them from rotting to the ground. The more we discovered about these little settler homes and villages, the more questions began to fill our inquisitive minds. And the first question that most ask is how many people lived within the walls of these tiny settler cabins? With the next being, when did these settlers come on the scene here in the Lost River Valley? To answer the first question, you kind of have to answer the second question first. President Abraham Lincoln ratified the Homestead Act on May 20th, 1862. Remember, the Civil War did not end until 1865, so brother was still killing brother when this all started. Under the Homestead Act, U.S. citizens or possible U.S. citizens were given up to 168 acres of government lands, provided they lived on them, improved them, and paid a small registration fee. In all, more than 160 million acres of public land, or nearly 10% of the total area of the United States, went to creating the independence, freedom, and dream of these pioneers. What they built and earned was theirs, and could be passed on to their children instead of another land and business owner and their children.
Tell us what the pay was and what the price of the homestead would typically be.
A homestead would run you $100. That's the land, and that was 168 acres. Okay, how much would that cost in today's dollars?
160 acres might be anywhere. It could be hundreds of thousands, or it could be millions in a high price area.
Right. So they didn't have to worry about a bank. That was part of the draw out here, part of Lincoln's Homestead Act, and millions of acres were claimed by people from all over the world, not just the United States. Millions of acres. That made them, the property, they were like their own little kingdom, their own business. They were free, and that's what they were looking for. That dream was the freedom of having their own land, their own home, inheritance for their children. It was just something that was unheard of until that act.
In the modern day world, other than very high pay work, could somebody save in 1 year's time the amount needed to buy a house, much less a house and a spread of land?
Right, no.
Well, sadly, no.
They
is
say,
our answer.
They say the American dream now is, take out a loan and spend your whole life trying to pay it off. If you miss some payments, you give it all to the bank. Just to fight the elements, get your food, get the money out of the mountain, refine it, and then sell it and make your own land and spread and stuff. Took a lot of gumption. A lot of these were just kids, young couples that, got married and set up their own little home. 2 million homesteaders looking for their own business and land without being enslaved to a lending institution ran to the American West for what became known as the American Dream. Why a dream? Well, no fat yelling boss could fire them while growing fatter off of them. They could determine their own class instead of that top hat with a cigar. Their position in the community and their community was earned instead of given by the silver spoon blue blood, and their pay was their own. Their business and location in this world was determined by them, and not some red blood-sucking bank or company. Having their own land, business, and animals debt-free without being begotten to anyone but their spouse was absolutely fresh air, clean water, freedom. This act also included the African Americans, which, even before the Yankees won their freedom and membership to the Dream, the opportunity to own land and their own business as well without having to pay any owner for it became possible. In a 10-year span, half of Norway migrated to the Americas to escape the jobs that shortened their lives, such as mines, and paid them next to nothing. The population of the U.S. was 31,443,322 in 1860. Oregon had 52,465 residents at that time, and Idaho was part of the Washington Territory. By 1900, 40 years later, the U.S. population had grown to 76,212,168. Its population had more than doubled in 40 years. Oregon's population was 415,000. Its population had grown 8 times in 40 years. This freedom allowed 94% of all Americans to have their own business, land, and home debt-free, or to be a part of an employee-owned business like a mine, foundry, mill, farm, tannery, etc., that they put together, at least until 1913. When you have your own business, you make 7 to 10 times what an employee makes. Let that sink in for a minute or two. You'll begin to understand why this family business income now allowed for a spouse, family, a home, debt-free. On the other hand, due to the law of greed and demand, wages in Europe had dropped and land prices had increased, spreading the hope of the American freedom overseas. People drained out of Europe and Asia, willing to fight for freedom from those willing to drink their blood and eat their bones by oppression. America provided hope of being independent and free, a true dream of their own business, home, and land, without landowners, business owners, managers, and banks draining the wallowing in scraps they should be happy for peasant class life out of them. Couples in the 1870s generally did not marry in their teens like Hollywood would like you to believe. Actually, the average age for a man being married was 26, and the average age for a woman being married was 23. Many lonely men headed west without women, with hopes of sending for her later. In the settler West, this usually happened in a common law marriage until a minister showed in the area. Mail order brides also became common law wives. Since photos were not common then, it was worse than online dating today, because letters from the new desperate landowner and new cowboy took months to reach their destination with no photos, which didn't matter since they all seemed to be good looking. Traveling clergy would perform weddings when they visited, and even among the most rugged of people hoping for a new beginning in the Lost River Valley, divorce was almost unheard of. It wasn't even considered. Common law marriages were, let's say, very common and legally binding in every state of the territory of the Union within the United States. This type of marriage originated in the Bible, in Exodus 22, verse 16, where if a man seduces a virgin by consent, not rape, they are to marry and never divorce. This community or common consent law was passed in Europe after Martin Luther's observations from the Bible, and then passed on to England's colonies and laws for the USA. English courts held that it was possible for a couple to marry by simply giving themselves to each other by consent within the colonies. Not that most didn't want a church wedding. They did want one, and they would have most willingly had one like kings and queens if it didn't cost a king's or queen's ransom. The cost of a wedding during the 1870s, just for clergy and local government fees, was about $300. Now, to put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman, $3 in a 10-hour day during their 6-day work week, and a helper about $1.50 a day. And it costs about $1.20 a day just to live. So how much could they possibly save for a wedding? Craftsmen could save about $360 in a year, and the helper about $96, if they were very careful. The Civil War had just ended in 1865. Many had lost their family members, homes, businesses, animals, and even their food and tools, all to keep the war machine fed and closed on both sides. Husbands or possible husbands, and even those no one would consider for a husband, were lost to the war on both sides. When the states were not so united in their very uncivil war, rebuilding in the North and the South paid some money. Enough to pay for dried food, a wagon, tools, supplies, seed, and starter animals, in order to make a run for possible hope in the West. Yes, all they needed was about $360 to secure their freedom. Now for some, with the Civil War came a whole new set of amoral ways: violence, profanity, drunkenness, deception, degradation of the soul. During the war, both sides collected women as spoils of war and forced them into brothels as sex slaves. And this was supported by the split government to keep the men killing during the war. Liquor and tobacco were given as part of their rations, as well as any riches from the places they conquered. Their values and respect for themselves and others became forgotten within their strange new brotherhoods and fellowships that supported whatever lawless deeds they committed. Killing, destruction, deceiving, whoring, stealing during the war was the way of politics, and believed okay, as long as you didn't do it to a brother. Everything of the enemy, one not part of your group, was rightfully yours. At the end of the war, the men wanted for crimes often changed their names and went west. The women from the military brothels, if they survived, would choose a new name and go west, posing as widows, hoping for a loving man, husband, and family. The war damaged went west with the born-again oppressed, as well as the hopeful Christians from the eastern United States and Europe to seek independence. So to answer the first question, how many lived in a settler cabin? By today's standards, most families of that time were considered to be very large. In 1870, you would find that the average household contained 5 or 6 children that lived past 5 years of age, despite nearly half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. So generally it was between 1 and 10 people sharing 200 to 400 square feet of dirt floor, or about 50 square feet per person. Of course, don't forget that land. Each family member had about 20 acres of land, and you divided amongst the family, including the newest baby.
We talk about these cabins that they hauled the logs for, and these incredible handcrafted furniture items. And of course, one modern day view of that is, well, they had all the time in the world. They had more time than we did. Well, they probably had about 1/10 the time, because they didn't have electric lights and dishwashers and laundry machines. The routine stuff that we do, all of our everyday chores, were much more complicated and time consuming. But the reason, well, I count it as 2 reasons. And I've read some Eric Sloan writing on this topic.
So Eric Sloan is reason 1.
2 reasons. One reason is that they made every minute count. Every minute of their lives had to count. And there were times where their survival was threatened if they couldn't haul the water or chop the wood, start the fire. Those things that we do every day, and we take our electricity and our cook stoves and things for granted. It was all much more manual labor. But they had to make every minute count just for the sake of their survival. And reason number 2, I think, that they did such incredible things, handcrafted back in those days, is that they had fewer distractions. They didn't have the televisions and the cell phones and the PCs.
Oh, yeah.
And
I wonder
so
how many hours we waste on those.
they were a lot more focused. The attention spans and the skills of these people were just incredible.
Yeah, and they worked as a little community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody had their place. They knew what they had to to accomplish, and they were, like you said, nobody was lazy. They were, they had a fire inside of them to make this work.
Yeah, they had to.
Yeah, they had to. Yeah, otherwise they wouldn't make it. All of these sacrifices, for the most part, were to start a new life, were to find freedom for themselves and their posterity. To say when this all started for the Lost River Valley, we'll have to start with the Native Americans that hunted buffalo in the Lost River Valley, ever since they obtained horses that made their way from Europe about 300 years prior. They spent the summers in the valley. They maintained no permanent encampment due to the long, cold winters in the Lost River Valley, with the residents living between 5,500 and 7,000 feet above sea level. Yes, they have filmed movies about the Alps and Tibet here. When I see Mount McCaleb in a movie about Tibet or the Alps, I'm definitely enthralled because I want to see what else was shot in the Lost River Valley.
What's that?
A brand. Someone stuck a brand right there. Look at that.
That is, they nailed nails in.
Why'd they do that?
Because they got creative. It looks like a spider.
Well, it looked like a brand that you'd stick on it, like a WSS or something like that. Or
yeah, they were making artwork with nails. I want to take a close-up shot of that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't get it before.
Well, I just noticed it.
Okay, well, go ahead and talk about this structure here. And
the thing that's
finish up.
They didn't strip the bark off this. This is original bark, you know, from 120 years ago. And they just let it fall off with age and kind of used it for chinking. You know, it's not really good chinking, but if you notice right here, look right here. See that? See that in here? We have like a wedge. They made a wedge of wood along here and they shoved it in from that side. And then they stuck mud and straw or manure and straw and stuffed it in there from the outside. Which is all washed off by now. I noticed that you took pictures of stuff over there that it hadn't all washed off from, so maybe we could show
yeah.
that in there as well. This has been converted, this house, into a stable or a barn of some type, because you don't usually lock people in, you know, from the outside.
Right.
So they could lock their animals in there. During probably when they were calving or lambing, and the animals couldn't get to them, or if they wanted to keep horses in there during the winter, a lot of different things. I don't know, but it's a beautiful little one. It's a perfect example from that time, and it's a big one. It's like twice the size of the little ones we saw down valley. This is 20 by 20. we can look at that, and plus it has the original roof. A lot of them have put tin on the top afterwards, trying to preserve the old settler cabin. But maybe we can talk about that. Just give us a little rundown on how they did the roof here.
So, if you look at this roof. It's interesting, of course. You don't see modern roofs looking like this, but it's basically the little logs running up the gable of the roof and running up the pitch, and then there's some sod, there's some basically soil and vegetation kind of holding things together. But what's interesting is that there's a piece of joinery, there's a notch that joins this
bottom log right here?
This bottom log, and this is sort of like a stopper gutter that you would see in modern day houses. And interesting note, I've studied how the Native Americans make their wickiups, and to make a wickiup, it's not too different. The difference is with the wickiup, it can be shaped like a teepee, but basically you just arrange a bunch of logs, you lean a bunch of logs together, and then You put branches, leaves, sod, what have you, to kind of fill the gaps in between those logs, and you can light a fire inside, of course. And so the wickiup is
The Native American version of a cabin.
as far as materials are concerned, yeah, the
Yeah.
wickiup materials are not much different than one of these.
Yeah. Okay, so the original Native American residents will be included within this documentary, since over 50% of the population within the United States have some American ancestor within their DNA makeup, and even more so within the western United States. The Native Americans saw the Lost River Valley in the 1800s as 1,400 square miles of swamp full of buffalo to feed them before they went to their winter homes. The grass at the end of the summers was above the backs of the buffalo, and the beaver dams covered the entire Lost River Valley and all of its tributaries, from one end of the valley to the other. A forest of spruce, firs, and aspens filled what the swamp did not. Today, this valley has been harvested of its trees, and the swamp was drained long ago. What is left is a high mountain desert. It wouldn't even be recognizable by the original residents from 160 years ago. There were mills established up and down the Lost River Valley harvesting those trees generations ago. And you can see a line between existing trees and no trees on the sides of the mountains where the loggers could not harvest or reach the trees. Now, unless the valley is filled once more with beaver dams, so the valley goes back to being a giant swamp, the trees will not return. We do wish that the federal government had brought back buffalo instead of wolves, and so do the cattle killed in place of the buffalo each year by the wolves. Before the Homestead Act, trappers came to the Lost River Valley to trap or trade with the natives. In about 1830 or 31, John Work was the first European in the Lost River Valley. John was the first to describe the valley as a giant, lush, grass swamp filled with buffalo, beaver, deer, and antelope. Then in 1834 came Anton Godin, who was part European and part Native American. Anton came to the area to trade with the natives. He would bring in goods and trade them for furs. On one trade with some local Blackfoot and another trader named Bird, who was also half Native American and half European. Blackfoot with Bird, mostly Bird, decided they wanted Godin's goods without giving him furs in trade, and shot him in the back, killing him. I'm not sure if you've ever felt a beaver fur, but it is by far the softest, warmest pelt of fur you have ever felt. The beaver fur has no grain. You've heard of going against the grain? That is talking about furs or the hairs on your head. With most mammals, the hair will naturally fall one direction and resist the other. With a beaver's fur, it falls any direction naturally, thus making it extremely soft. And the Europeans used to line things like hats and cloaks with the fur. It makes a much better blanket, in my opinion. That is why there was such a high trading value and demand for beaver furs. Hunting and trapping in the mountains was a dangerous business. The mountain men who survived trapping and trading had to run in packs. The average lifespan of a mountain man on his own in the 1800s wilderness was right around 6 months. If you were by yourself and you fell off that horse, broke a bone, got cut, bit, or any other of countless possible injuries or dangerous encounters, you were on your own to catch that horse, get natural antibiotics, care for your wounds, avoid bears and other opportunistic predators like bankers and lawyers, set your own bones, or disinfect abrasions. If you drank water out of a stream with beaver or muskrat in it, you would be in a battle, fighting by yourself against thousands of microscopic bacteria called Giardia, trying to devour you. Bottom line, if you found a body broken, scraped up, scabbed, with an ugly line of 50-yard potty trot, body in the woods during the 1800s, you knew that poor guy had died without friends, or even without first-time acquaintances. The first Europeans that arrived as permanent settlers in the valley, John Lehman and Mr. Schwab, brought with them the sounds of wagons, loaded with supplies and tools, being pulled as a team through grass as high as their horses' backs. In 1867, 5 years after Lincoln's American dream was offered, they staked out 2,000 acres, 1,000 each, encompassing the sides of the Lost River, near where the reservoir sits in the valley today. They also claimed all of its water rights, so any using the river would have to pay them for the privilege. Though this prospect for their water rights never happened, they ingeniously built a sod and grass cabin, or a soddy, in the bank of a warm spring, heating the soddy with its fresh, non-beaver fever waters. Otherwise, they would need about 5 full cords of wood for additional heating. Using the heat from the spring only required a couple of cords a year for cooking. Also, no local government was around to hold them to just 168 acres as the act had declared. Within 2 years, the valley was beginning to be dotted with buckboard wagons, tents, and cabin starts. They were building not so much for the land, but because they were prospecting for any metals that might be of value in the area, while simultaneously farming their needed grains, roots, plants, chickens, goats, and beef to live. However, the settlers did hunt the buffalo and deer first to preserve their growing herds. Pony Express stations at each end of the valley from north to west were established to communicate with newly built military outposts at Chalice and Salmon. This cabin used to be a Pony Express cabin. And for some reason, a lot of people think the Pony Express was invented by the people of the United States, but it was actually invented by the Romans. When this was put together, the world really hadn't changed since the time of Rome. I mean, they had locomotives and telegraphs, but other than that, they were still pulling wagons with horses and using the Pony Express. Indians would come here during the summers. They would hunt buffalo, and but they really wouldn't winter here. The winters, they called this place the land of 2 long winters. And so even though it's beautiful for 6 months out of the year, it is pretty heavy winters the other 6. The Pony Express, that was originally here after they built the road up here. It wasn't a highway, but they built a road all the way over to Chalice by hand. I mean, it was shovel work. After they built that, the cabins, well, they pretty much stayed along the stream bed so they could have a well, and water. So they'd had the buffalo for food, and they would bring tack with them, mainly from Blackfoot. They set up a station down there where they could bring up tack and stuff. And they would keep that for the winter and store it in here. I don't think they ran the Pony Express during the winter because of the snow depth.
I, for one, have a lot of respect for the people who would ride horses and stay in very simple structures like this one, ride horses all day and face a lot of risk and danger in the course of every day of their lives. It's a different world from what we're used to, but it's certainly one that I have respect for.
That's well put. We found a little axe head. That's kind of interesting that it stayed there. This is probably what, 140 years old. This little cabin, and time it changed so much. You know, went from just buckboard, horse, tent, cabin, and then a road and then a railroad in 1901. They put a railroad up here. When the railroad came in and the mining just exploded, the main industry was cattle, sheep, mining, and some grain, you know, some potatoes, but they had to get a lot of their stuff outside the valley if it wasn't meat. So they'd have big teams bring it up from Blackfoot or maybe even further, if, you know, they had to. But the Pony Express, yeah, this guy probably ran, or the guys came here, they'd just stop temporarily, trade out their horse, get some food, and then go on up to the next stop, which is probably up by the summit. And then over the summit was probably another stop, and then Chalice. The military outposts were established to remove the natives from the area and settle them on reservations. The main trail to the Lost River Valley originally came from the west instead of south to north, like the highway runs today. Instead, it ran from today's Haley, Idaho, to Antelope Valley, west to east. By 1800, Antelope, the settlement, had a little post office and the first stage stop in the valley, as well as the first sheriff, Charles Fury. Mr. Fury was well-mannered, had a great sense of humor, and was very generous. Frank McLaren, a former Lost River resident, told the story of a group of settlers living in American Falls, a few days' travel from the Lost River Valley. One of the settlers heard of a relative in Virginia City, Montana, that a gang of horse thieves were on their way to steal their cattle and horses. The gang hid in the mountains in Antelope Valley. They built a camp within Antelope Valley and would keep their stolen horses for a year until they bore foals. Now, being without horses and cattle meant a death sentence to most settlers. The settlers of American Falls tried to gather and keep their open-range animals within makeshift sagebrush fences in anticipation of the coming thieves. When the masked outlaws arrived, the little settlement was not quite ready for them. In the process of the thieves fighting to steal the settlers' horses and cattle, one of the horse thieves was captured, to the crazed Confederate shame, by the lowly settlers. To get the horses back, the captured thief was put in a noose and held ransom for the settlers' animals. The thief, in a foaming, furious fit, slipped and hung himself. The outlaws were greatly outnumbered, and the settlers started looking for the scattered thieves and stolen animals themselves. A strange thing happened. A person told the American Falls sheriff what was happening, and they put together a posse to round up the settler men and charge them with murder. They did not send anyone after the rustlers, the Lie or Die gang, or to help find the stolen cattle and horses. It was as if the sheriff and his posse were in support of the Lie or Die gang themselves. The lawless lawmen chained and staked the settler men within a giant tent in American Falls. They called the chains Bear Chains. That night, the women and children of the chained men came and freed their husbands and fathers. Something also interesting that Frank McLaren said is that some of the people in the chains and the people freeing them were direct descendants of Daniel Boone. A creek in the Lost River Valley, which one of the Boones settled, is called Boone Creek to this day. They should have called it Bear-Chained Boone Creek. Back to the story. After their self-imposed freedom from the lawless lawmen, the village of settlers started that night on a trek across the cold lava fields of Craters of the Moon to resettle in the Lost River Valley, not knowing that was where the horse rustling gang had homesteaded as well. The American Falls lawless lawmen did not want a war they had started with the settlers to come into public view, so they left them alone, like they did the horse thieves they had become accomplices with. A marshal who was not from the valley looked for one of the ringleaders of the Lie or Die gang that went into hiding. A year later, the marshal caught the man in Colorado and brought him to American Falls for sentencing. The thieving Lie or Die gang boss was quickly pardoned by the judge. Oh, justice hurts, but injustice dealt by the infinite number of the Lie or Die gang hurts venomously.